Well, hi there, I'm Noah Bradley. This is Handmade House TV, and on today's episode, I'm going to answer a few questions that I received with regard to flooring in log cabins. So stay tuned. So here recently, I got an email from one of you guys had some great questions with regard to flooring for a log cabin. In the Log Cabin Academy, we cover the topic pretty good, but there's actually a few points here that I was asked in this email that I thought were really valid, and I ought to create a special video to respond to those. And it's all with regard to the flooring on the second floor of a log cabin. It's a different consideration than the first floor, and what we want to use is entirely different than what we want to use on the first floor. For one thing, the second floor it's not just the flooring above, but it's often just the ceiling that we see when we're on the first floor and we look up. It's that material that we see in between the floor joist. They can be the same material, the flooring as well as your ceiling goes. And this particular individual, who's one of my favorite members of the Handmade House Guild, they requested, they were going to get ready to use some hemlock, and it sounds like they're going to saw it themselves, and they're shooting for 2 inches thick. And they had some questions with regard to the dryness of the material before it's used. And it sounds like they're thinking of stacking it up on stickers, the proper way to do it, allowing to air dry for up to 8 months, and wondered whether or not that was enough time to do that. The 2 inches thick is wonderful. That's a little bit thicker than I usually use. I generally go with 1.5 inches. Hemlock is a wonderful species to go with. Any softwood looks much better in a log cabin than a hardwood. And hemlock is one of my favorites. Hemlock, white pine, and heart pine are at the top 3 of my list, with oak and any loud wood like walnut that shows you the sapwood as well as the heartwood. It's a little too busy. I avoid those as much as possible. So hemlock is an excellent choice. 2 inches is a good choice. Air drying. Let me say that of all of the wood that you put in your house, probably the most important wood that you use that is dry as can be is your flooring. I have never had an incident in my career where the flooring was too dry, but I have incidences where I have put it down where the moisture content was higher than it should have been. And it created a problem because when it dried, when it seasoned after being installed, gaps appeared between the individual floorboards. And when we're building a house during the construction process, the house is open, and so humidity comes in. A lot of the material we got perhaps has gotten rained on or wet during the process. It never fails that the inside of a home is higher moisture content than the outside of the home. And we're constantly bringing in moisture into the home. When we're chinking, we're applying a wet cement inside that has to dry out as it seasons. If we're applying paint, it's drying out as well. When we're applying drywall mud, we're constantly bringing in water. When we're washing things, when we're cleaning up things inside, we're constantly bringing in more and more moisture. And then on the flip side of that, once we have moved into our home, and we either use a wood stove to heat the home during the winter time, or nowadays that we're trying to build our home as airtight as possible, and we bring in some kind of forced air heating system, whether or not it's a heat pump system or a furnace. It never fails that during the winter time the air is bone dry in our homes. A lot of times we have to use humidifiers in order just to make the home more comfortable and healthy for us to be inside of. So when you're putting down this flooring, if it's air dried and you're bringing it into a wet environment for a few days before you put it down, and then during the winter time we fire up all of our heating systems and the wood just naturally dries, it doesn't dry and expand again, it just dries and we end up with gaps between our wood. So I advise you to do the best you possibly can to make sure that when you put down your flooring that it is bone dry as you can possibly make it, and that when you put it down you pack it together, you drive each piece together as tightly as you possibly can in order to ensure that you're pleased with the finished product of your flooring long after you move into the home. And the way to do that is first of all, I really wouldn't trust air-dried wood unless it had been drying for years, especially if it's 2 inches thick. That takes quite a while to dry. If I was sawing my own wood and I wanted to use it within a year's time, I would seek out some place that could kiln dry that wood for me, and I would get it from that kiln and installed within as hours if possible, not bring it onto the job site and keep it there for days. If I was picking it up from a place that had kiln dried it, I would probably wrap and tape it in plastic as much as I could. I would get it to the job site and I would do my best to keep it as moisture free as possible before I put it down. So I hope that answers your question. Make sure that wood is as dry as you possibly can. Also, I would make sure that you go ahead, if you're milling your own, to go ahead and tongue and groove it. Don't just count on butting pieces of wood together without some kind of joinery. A shiplap joint works, but a tongue and groove is much better. If you put down wood and without some kind of tongue and groove on the sides of the boards, very likely you're going to have gaps appear between it, and anything that's dropped or spilled upstairs is going to come flowing downstairs. And light penetration will go through as well as sound. So I hope that answers that question. Also, the question goes on to ask about the width of the flooring upstairs. If you've been through the Log Cabin Academy, which I'm sure you have been, you know that downstairs I like to put as wide of a flooring as possible, and random width is nice as well. But generally for the second floor, where you're using such thick pieces of wood, 6 inches looks really nice upstairs in a log cabin. And so I typically, if I'm going to go with that thick of a flooring, 6 inches is just fine. Any narrower looks a little bit chintzy, and any wider than that, you really don't need it. And also, the wider your wood, the more chance you're going to have of shrinkage, of gaps appearing between each course of the board as it dries and ages. So I would 6 inches is the preference there. And then the question is with regard to nailing the board down, and they're referring to perhaps the idea of using some antique nails, or other people I've seen will use vintage reproduction type nails. And I generally, well, I wouldn't say generally, I'd say I never use nails that one can see on flooring when you're looking down. It really wasn't ever done other than perhaps in a barn or an outbuilding, and there's so many problems associated with it. It looks too busy. It doesn't look professional. And but for me, I'm a sock kind of guy or a barefoot kind of guy when I'm in the house, and there's so much of a chance of a nail rising a little bit, or a little bit of a barb appearing on it, that you'll snag your socks or cut your feet on nails. So I really don't want to use nails that are exposed whatsoever in my flooring. And so I always blind nail them. I nail them in the tongue of each piece as it goes down, angling it in. It secures your wood just wonderful, and you never see those nails. And it actually makes your floor look better and last longer and be more appreciative, more beautiful. So I think I covered all the questions in this email, and they were actually some really good ones. If you're going to put down the flooring in your log cabin, if you're going to do the trim work of the cabinetry, make sure that all the wood you work with is bone dry. It's kiln dried. It's as dry as what it can ever face. That the humidity level, you can actually buy testing meters to test the moisture content within your wood. I don't I don't think I've ever done that myself. I just make sure that it is as dry as possible, and if you do that, you'll be pleased with the finished result. Anyway, thank you for tuning in here to Handmade House TV. We'll see you next week here. I've got another great episode planned. We'll talk to you then. Bye now.